My name is Ophelia. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I've worked in roles where reliability mattered more than visibility, and in families where being the calm one quietly became a job description. If you asked the people around me who I was back then, they'd probably say I was strong, but in a way that didn't require much attention. The kind of strength that doesn't interrupt dinner conversations, the kind that doesn't make demands, the kind that's always there when something goes wrong, but never asks to be acknowledged when things go right. I was underestimated in a very specific way. Not because people thought I was incapable, but because they assumed I would always absorb more. More responsibility, more inconvenience, more silence. I didn't push back loudly, I didn't dramatize my needs, and over time, that calm became a blank check others felt entitled to cash. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic fallout or a villain being exposed under a spotlight. It's about something quieter, and I think more uncomfortable. It's about what happens when you are positioned as the solution to everyone else's emergencies, when your stability becomes a shared resource, when your boundaries are treated as optional because they've never existed before. For years, I was my family's emergency fund. Not just financially, emotionally, logistically, psychologically. When something broke, I fixed it. When someone panicked, I steadied them. When a line needed to be crossed just this once, it was usually mine. And then one day I said no. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Not with a list of grievances or a slammed door. I simply stopped extending myself past a line I finally learned how to see. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I became different, but because the story they told about me could no longer stay intact. This is a story about boundaries and the strange way they rewrite other people's memories, about how the person who never complained can become selfish overnight, about the emotional whiplash that happens when quiet support is mistaken for obligation and then withdrawn. I'm telling this honestly, without exaggeration, because I think many people recognize themselves in roles like the one I played. If you've ever been valued mainly for what you provide, rather than who you are, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered who you'd become if you stopped being the one everyone leans on? I didn't notice when it started, which feels important to say. Roles like the one I played don't arrive with an announcement. No one sits you down and explains that you've been elected as the reliable one, the fallback, the quiet solution. It happens slowly, through repetition, through small decisions that seem harmless in isolation. To my family, I was the one who had it together. That phrase followed me everywhere. If there was a problem, someone would say, "Ophelia will know what to do." If there was tension, "Let's ask Ophelia, she's level-headed." If there was a bill unpaid, a deadline missed, an unexpected expense, my name surfaced naturally, as if it had always belonged there. I wasn't the loudest. I wasn't the most emotionally expressive. I didn't compete for attention at family gatherings. I listened more than I spoke. I remembered details others forgot, dates, preferences, unresolved issues, and quietly adjusted myself around them. I thought that was kindness. I thought that was maturity. Invisibility doesn't always feel like neglect. Sometimes it feels like trust. I was praised often, but vaguely. "You're so strong. You're so independent. We don't worry about you." At the time, I wore those comments like medals. It felt good to be seen as capable, as the one who didn't need managing. I didn't realize that "we don't worry about you" also meant "we don't check on you." When something went wrong in my own life, I handled it privately. That reinforced the narrative. I became proof that I didn't need support because I rarely asked for it. And the less I asked, the more natural it felt for others to ask me. It wasn't just money, though that came later. It was time, emotional labor, decision-making. I was consulted after decisions were already half made, usually to make them safer, cleaner, and more responsible. I wasn't invited into the excitement, just the aftermath. At holidays, I was the one making sure things ran smoothly. In crises, I was the one called after everyone else had panicked. I didn't interrupt. I didn't complain. I told myself that everyone contributes differently, and this just happened to be my contribution. I see now how neatly that thought protected everyone else from questioning it. No one ever asked if I wanted the role. They didn't have to. I never declined it. From the outside, it probably looked like I was respected. And in a way, I was. But it was a very specific kind of respect. The kind you give a tool that never fails. You rely on it. You expect it to work. You don't ask how it feels about being used. I became dependable in a way that erased curiosity about me. People knew what I would do before I did it. They assumed my yes before the question finished forming. My predictability made things easier for them. And because nothing visibly broke, no one considered that something might be wearing down. I don't say this with resentment. At least, not anymore. At the time, I felt almost proud. I told myself that being needed was a form of love. That reliability was its own intimacy. That if I just stayed steady enough, everything would stay balanced. But balance like that is an illusion. It depends on one person staying still while everyone else leans. The truth is, no one saw me as someone who might one day step back. That possibility didn't exist in their version of me. I was the background constant, not a variable. The system worked because I never changed. And I didn't yet know that the moment I did, even quietly, I would become unrecognizable to them. At that stage, though, I was still inside the role, still identifying with it, still believing that being useful was the same as being valued. I hadn't yet learned the difference. The first moment didn't look like a betrayal. That's what makes it hard to explain now. It was small enough to dismiss, easy enough to rationalize, and quiet enough that no one else even noticed it happen. It was a phone call, late afternoon. I remember because I was still at my desk, finishing a report, my coat already folded over the chair. My sister's name lit up my screen, and I answered without hesitation. Her voice was tight, controlled in that way people get when they're already past panic and trying to sound reasonable. She needed money, not a huge amount. Not an emergency exactly. Something had come up, a timing issue. She framed it carefully, with just enough explanation to make it sound temporary and unavoidable. I said yes almost automatically. That wasn't the cut. The cut came afterward, in the way the conversation ended. There was no pause, no checking in, no acknowledgement that she was asking me to rearrange something on my end. She thanked me quickly, distracted, already moving on to the next problem she needed to solve. I remember sitting there, phone in my hand, listening to the deadline, and feeling something faint but sharp move through me. Not anger, more like a misalignment. As if a small assumption I didn't know I'd been carrying had slipped. I told myself it was nothing. Later that week, I heard her retelling the story to someone else. Not maliciously, casually. She said, "Ophelia covered it," the same way you'd say, "The insurance handled it." No tone, no emphasis, just a fact. No one corrected it. No one added anything. That's when I noticed it wasn't just the act of helping that mattered. It was how invisible the cost had become. I started paying attention after that. Not in a suspicious way, more like someone adjusting their vision. Small things came into focus that I'd previously blurred out. Requests framed as assumptions, decisions made with my involvement already calculated in, conversations where my role was discussed in my absence, as if it were fixed infrastructure. When I hesitated once, just a pause, not even a refusal, it was met with confusion. "You're okay with it, right?" The question wasn't really a question. It was reassurance seeking, not consent seeking. I said yes anyway. I told myself they didn't mean harm. And that was true, but intent doesn't erase impact. It just makes it easier to ignore. That first small cut didn't hurt much, but it changed how I listened. I noticed how often gratitude was implied rather than expressed. How quickly my contribution faded from memory once the problem was solved. Most of all, I noticed how alone I felt in those moments. Not isolated, just unseen. My presence only registered when something needed stabilizing. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even articulate it out loud to myself. I filed it away, like I'd done with so many things before. But something had shifted. I couldn't unfeel it. The cut was small, but it taught me where the blade was. Once you notice something, it has a way of repeating itself. Not because it's new, but because you've stopped editing it out. After that first moment, the pattern became clearer. Not louder, just more consistent. It showed up in everyday exchanges, in the tone people used with me, in the way requests were made without the courtesy of hesitation. Nothing overt enough to point to, nothing that would hold up if I tried to explain it to someone else. That was part of why I stayed quiet. How do you name something that looks like generosity from the outside? I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, that families lean on the most capable person, that my calm made others feel safe. I translated the discomfort into responsibility because responsibility felt noble. When plans changed last minute, no one checked whether it disrupted me. They just assumed I'd adjust. When money was tight elsewhere, my budget was discussed as if it were elastic. When someone needed emotional reassurance at inconvenient hours, they called me. Not because I was the closest, but because I wouldn't make it awkward. And I didn't. I absorbed it cleanly, quietly. I became very good at smoothing things over. I'd hear myself saying, "It's fine," even when it wasn't. Or, "Don't worry about it," when part of me wished someone would. The words came easily, rehearsed by years of use. Each time I minimized myself, it reinforced the role. I trained them, without realizing it, to expect less resistance, less need, less humanity. There was a moment, small again, when I almost said something. A comment made in passing about how I was lucky not to have as many obligations as the rest of them. It wasn't true. My obligations were just quieter, less visible. I smiled and let it go. I told myself that correcting it would be petty, that I didn't want to be someone who keeps score, that love shouldn't require accounting. But boundaries aren't accounting, they're context, and I had removed all of mine. The strange thing is, the more I gave, the less careful people became. They didn't become cruel, they became casual. Familiarity dulled the edges of consideration. I noticed how often my help was treated as a given, while others' help was praised. How my sacrifices were expected, while theirs were optional. The imbalance was subtle, but it was there. And still I stayed, still I said yes. Part of me believed that if I just held steady, it would even out. That eventually someone would notice, that the system would self-correct. It didn't. Instead, the quiet disrespect became normalized, not just by them, but by me. I lowered my own expectations so the gap wouldn't hurt as much. I told myself that being needed was enough, that acknowledgement was unnecessary. But there's a cost to that kind of rationalization. It doesn't disappear, it settles, it accumulates. And one day, you realize you've been living in a story where your presence is assumed, but your absence has never been imagined. It took me longer than I like to admit to understand that this wasn't just a series of moments, it was a role. And roles, once assigned, come with expectations that don't need to be spoken aloud. I was the reliable one, the rational one, the one who didn't complicate things. In family dynamics, that meant I was consulted last and relied on first. I was brought in to clean up, not to weigh in. My opinion mattered only after a decision had already been made, and even then, only if it made things easier. No one said, "This is who you are." They didn't have to. The pattern said it for them. I noticed how quickly discomfort was redirected toward me. If someone felt overwhelmed, I was expected to absorb it. If there was tension between others, I became the neutral ground. I was the buffer, the stabilizer, the place where emotions were offloaded so they wouldn't spill elsewhere. It sounds generous, and in isolation it was, but generosity without limits becomes an obligation. I wasn't asked how I was doing. I was asked what I thought should be done. I wasn't invited to rest. I was relied upon to keep things moving. My inner life, my fatigue, my doubts, my own needs, was irrelevant to the role. It didn't fit the script. The most unsettling realization was that I had participated in this, not consciously, but consistently. Every time I smoothed over a moment that deserved friction, I reinforced the role. Every time I chose silence over discomfort, I taught them what to expect. There was a strange safety in it. If I stayed within the role, there was no conflict, no disappointment, no accusations. I knew how to perform it well. But I also noticed how boxed in I felt. Like any deviation, even a small one, would be treated as a malfunction. As if I were breaking an unspoken contract. I remember thinking, if I ever say no, it won't just be a refusal. It will be a disruption. That thought stayed with me. Because roles aren't neutral. They distribute power quietly. And the one who absorbs the most responsibility often has the least room to change. I wasn't seen as someone with limits. I was seen as a resource, a dependable one, but still a resource, something to be used when needed, not checked on when strained. And the more invisible my effort became, the more permanent the role felt. I hadn't yet decided to step out of it. I didn't even know how, but for the first time, I could name it. I was no longer just being helpful. I was being assigned. There wasn't an argument. No raised voices. No breaking point that would look dramatic if I described it out of context. That's important, because for a long time, I thought change had to arrive loudly to be valid. It didn't. It happened on a quiet afternoon, alone. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, a cup of tea going cold beside me. I had just finished transferring money, again. Another short-term fix, another promise that it would all settle soon. I remember staring at the confirmation screen longer than necessary, not because of the number, but because of what it represented, not help, expectation. For the first time, I didn't feel generous. I felt designated. That word landed heavily, as if I'd been chosen without consent, as if my life had been quietly structured around being available for everyone else's instability. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I realized something that day that I hadn't allowed myself to articulate before. If nothing changed, this would continue indefinitely. Not because anyone was malicious, but because systems don't correct themselves when they're comfortable. I closed the laptop and sat there, hands folded, listening to the silence. There was no urgency in it, just space. And in that space, a thought surfaced that surprised me with its calmness. I don't have to do this. Not I won't, not yet, just I don't have to. It sounds small. But that sentence cracked something open. Until then, every request had felt inevitable. Saying yes wasn't a decision, it was gravity. That afternoon, gravity loosened its grip. I started asking myself questions I'd never asked before. Not accusatory ones, practical one. What would happen if I delayed responding? What would happen if I said no once? Who would step in if I didn't? I didn't answer them yet. I just noticed that I was allowed to ask. That was the shift, not rebellion, awareness. Nothing changed externally that day. I still showed up, still responded, still played the role, but internally, the narrative had altered. I was no longer inside the system without seeing it. I slept differently that night. Not better, but deeper. As if my body recognized that something had aligned, that a truth had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't been acted on yet. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make a plan. But I stopped assuming. And once that assumption disappeared, everything else became possible. After that day, my silence changed texture. It used to be reflexive, something I fell into because it felt easier, kinder, less disruptive. Now it was deliberate. I didn't announce this shift. I simply began to pause. When messages came in, I didn't respond immediately. Not to punish, not to manipulate, but to feel the space between request and response. I wanted to know what my instinct actually was, without the pressure of being predictable. At first, nothing happened. People filled the silence with assumptions. They told themselves I was busy, or tired, or would reply soon. No one checked in to ask. They didn't need to. The old pattern had trained them well. I noticed how quickly my absence was normalized, how little curiosity it generated. That observation didn't hurt the way it once would have. It clarified. Silence, I learned, is unsettling only when people rely on your noise to function. Mine had been doing quiet work for years. I began choosing what I responded to, and how. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped softening every boundary with reassurance. I used fewer words, but more accurate ones. People mistook this for weakness, or indifference, or stress. One person joked that I was finally dropping the ball. I didn't correct them. What they didn't see was how much stronger I felt. Not outwardly, internally. Like I'd stepped back into my own body after years of being stretched thin across other people's needs. I listened more than I spoke, but now I listened for patterns, not just feelings. I noticed who adjusted when I didn't immediately accommodate, and who simply waited for me to resume my role. That distinction mattered. I wasn't withdrawing, I was observing. Silence stopped being something done to me. It became something I used. And in that quiet, I began to see clearly who I had been to them, and who I was becoming without their expectations filling the space. While everything looked the same on the surface, something else was happening underneath, something no one thought to look for. I began preparing, not dramatically, not with secret meetings or grand declarations. I prepared the way people like me always do, quietly, methodically, without asking for permission. I started documenting things I had previously kept only in my head. Dates, amounts, patterns, promises that had been framed as temporary, but repeated often enough to become permanent. I wrote them down in that leather notebook I'd carried for years, the one people assumed was for work. It wasn't resentment that drove me. It was accurate. For the first time, I wanted to see the full picture, unsoftened by generosity, unblurred by habit. I wanted to know exactly how much of my life had been structured around other people's emergencies. The numbers were sobering, but not shocking. What surprised me more was the consistency, the predictability, how often I'd been positioned as the answer before the question even finished forming. I also started learning. Quietly. I read about boundaries, not the inspirational kind, but the practical kind. Financial autonomy, family systems, the difference between support and enablement. I didn't share this with anyone. Not because it was secret, but because it was mine. For once, my growth wasn't designed to stabilize anyone else. I reviewed my accounts. I separated things that had been casually blended. I made sure my name stood on its own. No ambiguity, no assumptions, no shared access that relied solely on trust. Trust, I had learned, works best when paired with clarity. Outwardly, I was still the same Ophelia. Still calm, still reliable, still present. No one felt threatened, no one sensed withdrawal. That was the thing about invisibility. It worked both ways. They never noticed that I'd stopped volunteering information, that I no longer fill silences with solutions. I let small inconveniences remain unsolved if they weren't mine to fix. They never noticed that I was building something internally, a structure that didn't rely on being needed. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like nothing until it looks like everything. And by the time anyone realized I was no longer positioned where they'd left me, I had already moved, quietly, completely on my own terms. The clarity didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with stillness. One evening, after weeks of documenting and reviewing, I sat alone and looked at everything laid out in front of me. Numbers, timelines, notes written in my own precise handwriting. There was no anger in me as I did it, no satisfaction, just an undeniable understanding. I was not part of a mutual support system. I was the system. That realization landed quietly, but it rearranged something fundamental. It explained why my fatigue had felt endless, why rest never quite restored me, why had my generosity slowly hollowed out instead of expanding. The leverage I discovered wasn't scandalous. There was no secret wrongdoing, no dramatic betrayal. It was simpler and more uncomfortable than that. They depended on my consistency more than they acknowledged. Financially, yes, but also emotionally, structurally. I was the stabilizing weight in an arrangement that only worked because I never shifted. I saw how many decisions were made assuming my presence as backup, how many risks others took because I absorbed the consequences, how many temporary arrangements had no end date except my compliance. And in that moment, I understood something else just as clearly. If I stepped back, things would not collapse, but they would change. And change, I knew, would be interpreted as harm. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible in a different way, responsible for myself. There was no urge to expose anything, no desire to confront or correct. I didn't want acknowledgement anymore. I wanted alignment. I closed the notebook and sat there, breathing evenly. The room felt quiet in a way it never had before, not empty, intentional. This was the private reveal. The moment I stopped hoping the system would recognize me, I accepted that I would have to recognize myself. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And you don't need applause to act on it. You just need to resolve. Once the clarity settled in, the real work began. Not action yet, consideration. The kind that doesn't rush, because it understands that some decisions, once made, cannot be folded back into their original shape. I didn't decide immediately. That would have felt reactive, and I had spent too many years reacting. Instead, I sat with the options. I treated them like objects on a table, examining each one carefully, turning them over, noticing not just what they promised, but what they cost. The first option was the most familiar one: do nothing. Continue as I had, but with awareness. Keep helping, keep stabilizing, keep absorbing, maybe adjust slightly, maybe feel less surprised next time. This option offered peace on the surface, no conflict, no uncomfortable conversations, no shift in how people saw me. But when I stayed with that option long enough, something in me resisted. Awareness without change wasn't wisdom, it was endurance. And endurance, I realized, was exactly what had been draining me. Doing nothing would mean accepting that my life would always be reactive, that my energy would always be reserved for repair, that my future would be shaped around preventing other people's discomfort. I set that option aside. The second option was confrontation. I imagined sitting everyone down, explaining calmly how things had accumulated, presenting the facts, asking for change, negotiating new terms. It sounded reasonable, mature, fair, but when I imagined it fully, not just the ideal version, but the likely one, I felt something tighten. Because confrontation assumes shared readiness. It assumes the other side is willing to see what they've benefited from without becoming defensive. It assumes they want to change a system that works for them. I knew my family well enough to know what would happen. They wouldn't hear structure, they'd hear accusation. They wouldn't see patterns, they'd see ingratitude. The conversation would become emotional, not corrective. And worst of all, it would position me as someone asking for permission to step out of a role that was never consensual to begin with. I didn't want to negotiate my autonomy. I set that option aside too. The third option was gradual withdrawal. This one tempted me. Reduce involvement slowly, say no more often, create distance so subtly that no one could point to a moment where things changed. It felt clever, strategic, but the more I examined it, the more it felt dishonest. To myself. It would keep me entangled, still orbiting the same system, still adjusting my life around its expectations. It would prolong the tension instead of resolving it. I didn't want to disappear quietly. I wanted to arrive somewhere else. That left the final option, the one I had avoided naming because of how definitive it felt. Refusal. Not a dramatic refusal, not punitive refusal, just a clear, clean line. A no that didn't come with a replacement, yes. A boundary that didn't apologize for existing. A choice that didn't require understanding to be valid. This option frightened me, not because it was wrong, but because it was irreversible. Once I said no in a meaningful way, the stories others told about me would change. Permanently. I would no longer be the safe assumption. I would no longer be the invisible backup. I would no longer be predictable. And I knew something else too. The moment I set that boundary, I would not be seen as the same Ophelia, just tired. I would be seen as different. Different is threatening in systems built on stability, especially when that stability has relied on one person staying flexible. I spent days with that realization, letting it settle, testing it against my values. Was I being selfish, or was I finally being accurate? I thought about the years I'd spent cushioning consequences that weren't mine, about the quiet fatigue I carried into every room, about how rarely anyone asked what I needed, because I'd taught them not to. I thought about the version of myself 10 years from now if nothing changed. Still dependable, still exhausted, still unseen. And then I thought about the version of myself who chose differently. Not happier overnight, not free of grief, but aligned. The decision wasn't emotional in the end. It was ethical. I asked myself one final question, and I answered it honestly. If I continue like this, am I being kind, or am I avoiding discomfort at the cost of my own life? The answer was clear. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was dramatic, not because it would teach anyone a lesson, but because it was the only choice that didn't require me to keep disappearing. Once that decision was made, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Not relief, not triumph. Just the quiet steadiness of someone who has stopped negotiating with gravity and started walking in a direction of her own choosing. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to act immediately. That surprised me. I had expected urgency, maybe even adrenaline. Instead, there was patience, the kind that comes after clarity, not before it. I understood something crucial. The boundary wouldn't begin with a conversation. It would begin with structure. So I moved in silence. Not secrecy. Silence. There's a difference. Secrecy hides because it fears exposure. Silence moves because it doesn't need permission. The first changes were administrative, boring, invisible, and therefore powerful. I separated accounts that had been casually intertwined for convenience. I closed access points that relied on trust instead of intention. I changed how automatic things were. Payments, transfers, obligations that had been set up years ago and never revisited because they were easier to leave running than to question. No one noticed. Why would they? Everything still worked until it wouldn't. I reviewed documents carefully. Old agreements, informal understandings that had somehow become expectations. I noticed how often my name appeared as the stabilizing clause, the fallback, the guarantor, the silent assurance that risks could be taken elsewhere. I removed myself from those positions, one by one. Not loudly, not with announcements, with clean exits and updated paperwork. Each action felt strangely grounding, like reclaiming physical space after years of standing in doorways. I also changed how I scheduled my time. I blocked off evenings that had once been flexible. I stopped being available by default. I didn't explain why. I simply wasn't there. At first, people filled the gap with optimism. She's probably busy. She'll get back to us. It's just a phase. I let them believe that. I didn't correct misunderstandings. I didn't preempt disappointment. I let reality arrive on its own schedule. This wasn't about punishment. It was about letting consequences exist without my intervention. I noticed how often I'd previously stepped in before things became uncomfortable for them. Now, I waited. I allowed small discomforts to remain unsmoothed, small problems remain unsolved, small panics to unfold without my steadying presence. And something interesting happened. Other people started making different choices. Not better ones, just different ones. They delayed decisions. They asked each other instead of me. They adjusted plans downward instead of assuming excess coverage. The system began recalibrating, slowly, uneasily, without acknowledgement. That's the thing about moving in silence. It doesn't provoke immediate resistance. It creates absence. And absence forces adaptation. I was careful not to overcorrect. I didn't swing from total availability to total withdrawal. I simply behaved like someone whose life belonged to her. Every step was intentional. I double-checked my motivations constantly. If something felt reactive, I paused. If something felt clean, I proceeded. I wasn't trying to shock anyone. I was trying to make my autonomy boring, because boring boundaries are harder to argue with. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, when old reflexes resurfaced. When I wondered if I was being cold, or unfair, or unnecessarily firm. In those moments, I returned to the facts, not the feelings. I looked at the records, the patterns, the years of quiet accommodation. And I reminded myself, this wasn't sudden. It was overdue. I also noticed something else during this time. No one asked me how I was doing. They asked when things would go back to normal. That told me everything. By the time the first real consequences began to surface, I was already elsewhere internally. No longer bracing, no longer explaining, no longer available to be pulled back into orbit. I had moved, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The consequences didn't arrive like an explosion. They crept in, uneven and disoriented, the way people do when they realize something essential is missing but can't yet name what it was. At first, it showed up as confusion. Messages came in that were slightly off in tone, less casual, more careful, questions disguised as statements. Just checking, did you see this? Not sure if you're aware, but we might need your help with something soon. I noticed the language shift immediately. The certainty was gone. The assumption had cracked. I didn't rush to fill the gap. Small problems that would have once been redirected to me began circulating instead. They bounced between people, unresolved longer than usual. Decisions stalled, timelines stretched. I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction, but with a strange neutrality, like observing weather patterns from inside a solid structure. Then came the mild frustration. Someone mentioned, offhandedly, that things felt harder lately. Another joked that everything used to run more smoothly. There was laughter, but it didn't quite land. I wasn't named yet, but I was implied. That's how systems respond when a stabilizing force is removed. They don't accuse right away. They search for the missing piece quietly, hoping it will return on its own. I stayed consistent, calm, polite, unavailable. When asked directly for help, I responded carefully. Sometimes with a no, sometimes with a limited yes that didn't stretch me thin or rescue anyone from consequences. I didn't over-justify. I didn't soften the edges. The reactions were subtle but telling. Surprise, discomfort, a faint sense of betrayal that no one quite articulated. I could feel the narrative shifting, not yet rewritten, but questioned. People began remembering my contributions only once they were absent. Not with gratitude, but with inconvenience. The loss was felt but not yet understood. There was a moment, small but sharp, when someone said, "This wouldn't have happened if Ophelia were handling it." I heard it secondhand. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Not because they were wrong, but because of what they revealed. I had been functioning as insurance, and insurance is only appreciated once it's gone. As weeks passed, the tone hardened slightly. Less confusion, more irritation. Requests became more urgent. Explanations are more detailed, as if clarity would persuade me back into the role. I listened. I declined. I remained steady. And something else began to emerge: accountability gaps. When I wasn't there to quietly absorb mistakes, they became visible. When I didn't smooth over missteps, they had to be owned. When I didn't step in early, problems escalated in ways that forced attention. This made people uncomfortable, not because they were incapable, but because they were unaccustomed to carrying the full weight of their choices. Still, no one confronted me directly. Not yet. Instead, the story adjusted around me. I was busy. I was different lately. I was hard to reach. Those labels were safer than asking why the system had depended on me so heavily in the first place. I didn't correct them. Correction would have required engagement. And engagement would have pulled me back into the gravity I had already escaped. What struck me most during this phase was how little curiosity there was about me. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked what had changed internally. They only wanted the old outcomes restored. That absence of curiosity sealed something in me. It confirmed that this wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about the loss of access. And once you see that clearly, you stop feeling guilty. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. The system was finally being asked to support itself, and I was no longer standing underneath it, holding everything up. By the time panic arrived, it was already misplaced. That's the strange thing about systems that rely on quiet labor. They don't recognize the labor as it's happening. They only recognize its absence once the strain becomes undeniable. And by then, the instinct isn't reflection, it's recovery. They didn't ask what they had missed. They asked how to put things back. The tone shifted again, not irritated anymore, urgent. Voices tightened, messages came faster. The pauses between them shortened, as if speed alone could recreate what had been lost. This was the phase where people started reaching backward. Can we just do it the way we used to? This never used to be a problem. You always handled this so well. There it was, always. That word carries a quiet demand. It assumes continuity, permanence, obligation disguised as praise. I heard it and felt nothing rise to meet it. No defensiveness, no temptation, just a steady awareness that what they were asking for no longer existed. Because what they wanted wasn't help. It was a restoration. They wanted the old structure, without examining how it had been built. They wanted my presence without my consent, my capacity without my cost. By then I could see clearly how late they were. They tried soft approaches first. Warm messages, nostalgia, references to shared history, moments of closeness that hadn't existed in years, suddenly revived as proof of connection. Then came justification. They explained why things were difficult, why timing bad, why this wasn't the moment for change, as if my boundaries were a scheduling inconvenience rather than a necessary correction. I listened. I understood, and I didn't move. What they couldn't accept yet was this. Even if I wanted to return to the role, I couldn't, because seeing a system clearly destroys the illusion that sustains it. I noticed how often they framed the situation as temporary, as if my withdrawal were a mood, a phase, a reaction that would pass once things stabilized. They didn't yet understand that I had stabilized, and stability changes your tolerance for chaos you used to manage for others. The pressure increased, not overtly, but emotionally. Disappointment wrapped in concern, confusion tinged with hurt, the subtle implication that I was abandoning something sacred. Family, loyalty, responsibility. Those words surfaced more often now. They didn't say selfish, not yet, but it hovered nearby, waiting for permission. I felt a flicker of grief during this stage. Not for the role, but for the realization that the connection had been so conditional, that my value had been measured largely by my willingness to remain flexible. That grief was quiet, private and necessary, because grief is what tells you something mattered, even if it was flawed. Still, I didn't reverse course. Not because I was proving a point, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The time for fixing it had passed long before they noticed there was a problem. It had passed the first time I felt invisible and convinced myself it was strength. The first time a temporary request became permanent. The first time I absorbed discomfort so no one else had to feel it. What they were experiencing now wasn't loss. It was reckoning. and reckoning feels cruel to people who never knew they were being carried. By the end of this phase, the tone hardened again, but differently than before. Less confusion, less urgency, more accusations. That's when I knew the next part was coming, because when restoration fails, systems don't ask how they were built. They look for someone to blame. The confrontation didn't happen all at once. It didn't arrive as a dramatic gathering or a raised voice argument that could be pointed to later as the moment everything broke. It came in fragments, conversations that circled the same truth without touching it directly, until finally, there was nowhere left to stand, except inside it. By the time someone spoke plainly, I had already rehearsed nothing. That was the difference. I wasn't braced. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't waiting for an opening to explain myself. I was simply done being misunderstood in silence. It happened in a living room I knew well. Familiar furniture, familiar light, the kind of place where roles are reinforced just by sitting in the same chairs you always have. I noticed that detail immediately, and I chose a different seat. That small choice mattered. The conversation started carefully. Concern first, how I'd been distant, how things felt strained, how people were worried about me. Concern is often the last socially acceptable way to apply pressure. I listened without interrupting. I didn't rush to reassure them. I let the discomfort breathe. Then the question sharpened. Why was I being so rigid? Why now? Didn't I understand how much everyone was struggling? There it was, the pivot from curiosity to obligation, I answered calmly. Not with stories, not with examples, not with a ledger of everything I'd done. I'm not available for that anymore. The sentence landed heavily in the room, not because it was loud, but because it had no flexibility in it. No apology, no negotiation. Someone laughed nervously, as if waiting for me to soften it. I didn't. They tried another angle, reminded me of how much I'd always helped, how dependable I'd been, how out of character this felt. I nodded. I know. That was all. It unsettled them more than anger ever could have. Anger invites argument. Calm forces reflection or rejection. Then came the word I had been expecting. Selfish. It wasn't shouted. It was offered, almost gently, as if naming it would solve everything. As if this were a misunderstanding of intent, rather than a boundary of capacity. I didn't flinch. I don't agree, I said, but I understand why it feels that way to you. That sentence changed the temperature of the room, because I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't trying to be seen as good. I was acknowledging their experience without surrendering my own. They pressed harder after that, spoke about family, about loyalty, about how people show up for each other, about sacrifice. I listened. Truly. And then I said something that had taken me years to understand. I've shown up consistently for a long time. This isn't me abandoning responsibility. This is me choosing which responsibilities are actually mine. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that signals a rupture in narrative. They wanted a version of me they could argue with. Someone emotional, someone reactive, someone who could be painted as unfair. What they got instead was someone steady. That's when the accusations escalated, not in volume, but in intent. They suggested I'd changed, that I was colder, that something had gotten into my head, that I was prioritizing myself over us. I didn't correct the framing. Yes, I said quietly, I am prioritizing myself. That was the moment I felt the old role finally dissolve. Not with relief, but with gravity. Because prioritizing yourself, when you've built an identity around being useful to others, feels like betrayal, to them, and sometimes to the echo of who you used to be. I didn't explain further. I didn't justify my reasoning. I didn't list the invisible labor or the quiet years of accommodation. Explanations invite debate. Boundaries invite adjustment. I had already adjusted. What struck me most during that confrontation wasn't their anger. It was their confusion. They truly didn't know how to relate to me without access to my flexibility. They didn't know who I was if I wasn't solving something. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something essential. They hadn't lost me. They had lost use of me, and that loss felt personal to them. The conversation ended without resolution. Not because it failed, but because it wasn't designed to fix anything. It was designed to mark a line. I left without slamming doors, without tears, without the urge to replay it endlessly in my head. Outside, the air felt cooler, quieter, real. I realized then that confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. It just has to be grounded in a truth you're no longer willing to abandon. I hadn't demanded understanding. I had demonstrated self-respect, and that, more than anything I could have said, told them the role was gone for good. After everything settled, or rather, after it stopped trying to settle back into its old shape, I noticed something unexpected. I was quieter, but not smaller. For a long time, I had confused peace with compliance. I thought calm came from keeping things smooth, from anticipating needs before they became demands, from absorbing tension so it wouldn't spread. Now I understand the difference. This calm came from alignment. My days looked ordinary from the outside. I still worked, still showed up to obligations I chose, still answered messages, still cared. Nothing about my life screamed transformation. And yet everything had changed. I woke up without the low-level vigilance I hadn't known I carried for years. The constant background awareness of who might need something, who might be struggling, what I should preemptively fix. That vigilance had shaped my nervous system more than I realized. Without it, my body felt present. I noticed how much energy I had reclaimed, simply by not managing other people's stability. Evenings stretched open, my thoughts slowed. I could sit with discomfort, mine or others, without rushing to resolve it. That was new. I also noticed something else. My sense of identity had shifted away from usefulness. For years, if someone had asked me who I was, my answer would have been wrapped around what I did for others. The solver, the dependable one, the calm center. Now those descriptors felt incomplete. I was still capable, still reliable, but those traits no longer defined my worth. They were qualities I possessed, not services I owed. That distinction changed how I moved through the world. I became more selective with my generosity. Not colder, clearer. I gave when it felt mutual, when it didn't cost me invisibility. I declined without rehearsing explanations in my head. And something subtle but profound happened in my relationships. The ones built on access faded. Slowly, without drama. Conversations became shorter. Invitations became rarer. The role I used to play had been the glue, and without it, there was less reason to reach out. That used to scare me. Now it felt accurate. Other relationships are adjusted instead of dissolving. A few people surprised me. They learned how to engage with me differently. They asked instead of assuming. They listened when I said no. Those relationships deepened. Not because I gave more, but because I existed fully within them. I also learned to tolerate being misunderstood. That was harder than I expected. There were moments when I heard, indirectly, how I was being described now. Distant, changed, self-focused, difficult. I didn't rush to correct those narratives. Not because they were true, but because they weren't mine to manage anymore. I realized something important. When you stop performing a role that benefited others, their disappointment doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means the arrangement has ended. And endings don't require consensus. Who I am now is someone who understands that boundaries don't make you selfish. They make you specific. They tell the world exactly where you begin and end. I am no longer the emergency fund. Not financially, not emotionally, not psychologically. I am a person with capacity, not a system designed to absorb collapse. That doesn't make me less loving. It makes my love intentional. I still help. I still care. But I do it without disappearing, without erasing my own needs to keep the peace, without confusing endurance for virtue. If there's a quiet strength in me now, it comes from knowing this. I don't need to be needed to be valuable. And that knowledge has given me a steadiness no amount of approval ever could. There's a strange quiet that comes after a life like this reorients itself. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. It's the quiet of no longer rehearsing explanations, of no longer anticipating emergencies that aren't yours, of no longer wondering how much of yourself you'll need to give away, just to keep things stable. Looking back now, I can see that the hardest part was never saying no. It was accepting what that no would cost me. Not financially, not logistically, but narratively. Because when you stop being the solution, people have to rewrite the story they've been telling themselves about you. And sometimes, instead of revising it honestly, they protect it by recasting you as the problem. That used to hurt more than I expected. But over time, I learned something that changed how I held that pain. Being misunderstood is often the price of being free. I didn't lose my family. I lost a role. I didn't abandon responsibility. I clarified it. I didn't become selfish. I became visible to myself. And that visibility mattered more than approval ever did. This story isn't meant to suggest that helping others is wrong. It isn't. Care is what makes life humane. But care without consent becomes extraction. Generosity without boundaries becomes erasure, and strength that is never allowed to rest eventually turns into something brittle. What I know now is this. If your presence is only noticed when it's missing, you were never fully seen to begin with. That realization doesn't make you bitter, it makes you precise. I don't regret the years I spent showing up. They taught me discipline, empathy, and resilience. But I also don't regret stepping back, because staying would have required me to keep pretending that depletion was devotion. It wasn't. The moment I set boundaries, I became the selfish one in their story. And that used to feel like failure, until I understood that every system resists the loss of its quiet labor. Naming that resistance doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. If there's a moral here, it isn't dramatic, it's steady. You are allowed to stop being the emergency plan. You are allowed to change the terms without unanimous approval. You are allowed to choose a life that doesn't require you to disappear for others to function. And if someone can only love you when you are endlessly available, what they love is not you, it's the access. So I'll leave you with this, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer. Have you ever set a boundary that made someone see you differently? And did it ultimately cost you more to hold it or more to abandon it?